Cool. Good thing I didn't get into my intro.
Boom, boom.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Adam. So Adam is a mentor, advisor, and coach and podcast host. He has over a decade of experience in the tech and startup space, and as the host of The Founder's Mind and Socially Distanced. He has all kinds of knowledge on how to grow a network through podcasting, and today he's going to share some awesome tips and tricks on how to do that. Currently, he's a partner at the Kadar Group and empowering executives to lead through crisis in a remote first world. So thank you, Adam, and I will hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. And I just want to say I'm very appreciative of being invited into this community and the sort of chatter on social. It just got me really hyped for today. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen and I'll go through some slides. I think the call was already going, just again, heightening my quickly aging relationship with technology. So you probably already heard I'm a little free flow. So I had some questions in advance, but I'd love to hear from the group after I go through some of the slides. If there's any questions out there, let's spend some time answering them so that we can really tailor this. So let me start by clicking this present on and then share my screen. One moment, please. All right. Can people see this? Dope. And if you are comfortable with video, you're welcome to join with video. I think in this like remoteness, seeing people and getting reactions can be helpful, at least for me, if not for anything else. So leveraging your podcasts, insights and tips to growing relationships. I think it's at growing your network, and I have a love-hate relationship with network. It really stems from how do you build new relationships with individuals. And so my primary show is The Founder's Mind, and it was a product of me discovering that as I was building my business and doing business development, I got to meet a lot of people, and I was learning a lot from people, whether or not they hired me as one of their vendors or whether they became a client. And I ignorantly thought to myself in 2017, why don't I start a podcast? Because I'm already talking to founders and already learning a lot. And I'm going to go over a little bit of the Founder's Mind journey, some milestones, and then towards the end, just a handful of tips and a handful of resources, because I know that there were questions about like, how do you get started? What are the good, right tools and things like that.
And then, sorry, Adam, I just jump in real quick. And if everyone can make sure to mute themselves, I feel like there's a ton of background noise, so I just wanted to put a reminder. Okay.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you. And so in the first place, I couldn't decide if I wanted to put this at the end or the beginning, but I wanted to put it at the beginning because I think it's super important. Some really like high level basic myths around starting a show. You don't need to be an influencer to start a show. You don't need to be an audio savant. You don't have to have all the equipment in the world. And you don't need millions of listeners for the show to be worth it. So I was just recently shared a data point. The median number of downloads per episode in the podcast world, I think, is 137 per episode. So 50% of shows have less than 137 downloads per episode. 50% of shows have more. And you can do a lot with a group of listeners. Where I started with my show was this idea of I'm talking to founders. I'm spending time doing this. So what if I arranged conversations and with permission recorded, obviously with the intent of creating a show? And so when I thought about the name, I tried to think of something that wasn't necessarily the Adam Mutschler show. If you look at iTunes, there's a lot of shows out there, and no knock on straight white dudes, and I'm one of them, but a lot of us are like, interviews by, and then our name. And it's really like name heavy, personal name heavy. And I didn't want my show to be about me. I wanted it to be about the stories and the interviews. And so the name that I came up with, The Founder's Mind, not one, it came to me, but two, and I'll show you in a second, I validated it by seeing if it was available. But when you're thinking of a name for a show, think of something memorable, think of something relatable. Maybe it's descriptive within the title. And the last piece here is something that you can own, something that isn't everywhere already. and isn't necessarily already taken on all the different digital domains. And don't spend too much time on the name, but just think of something where you can put it. So Brooke mentioned Socially Distance is another show I have, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. But for me, it came up with the founder's name, the founder's mind, and I did something that I do with any business idea. This logo over here oh no, I pasted something by accident. Give me 1 second, because that'll be distracting for me. We'll get back to that in a moment. So there's a platform or a website called Namecheck. I recommend everyone writes this down. Namechk. It's one of my favorite websites. If you're someone who comes up with ideas all the time and you have these names and you're like, oh my gosh, I wonder if anyone has this name, you go to Namecheck, you type it in, and then there's this beautiful grid. And it's a green tile if it's available, it's a yellow tile if it's an incorrect syntax for the whatever platform, and it's red if it's taken. And so for me, it worked out very well. I typed in the founder's mind and it was green everywhere. And that meant two things for me. Either it's an awful name and no one wants it, or for some reason the universe was giving me a little wink and a little nudge and said, take the name. This is the finally of the thousands of things you've typed into Namecheck. Here's one of them that's available for you. And so when I say grab your digital real estate, or when I say take something you can own, really try and think of the name that you can be consistent across platforms. I think that that's helped the show a lot. So let's say the founder's mind for Instagram or Twitter wasn't available. I think totally appropriate alternates are like at the founder's mind pod, POD, or at the founder's mind show. There are different ways to label the name, but find something that you can use everywhere so that when you're advertising it, or when you're marketing it, or when you're creating links, you can just tell people it's at whatever your name is. So for me, I tell people thefoundersmind.com, at the founder's mind everywhere. Right? So a lot of people will have like 3 or 4 different types of handles, and it just becomes cumbersome. And I think finding it becomes cumbersome. And so I feel like I lucked out a little bit, but the lesson that I've learned is find something that's consistent across whatever .com and all the social channels. And Namecheck was a very big help. I'm not sponsored by them. I don't get any money from them, although I talk about them all the time because of this. This process takes time. And so one of the things as a coach and as an advisor and a mentor, I talk to a lot of startups and a lot of founders, and some people have podcasts and some people don't. I think one of the myths that comes up with podcasting is you look at someone who has a show either that has great guests or that has a huge audience, and we forget how much time and energy and effort it took to achieve any result, right? Unless you're Tim Ferriss and you say, I want to start a new media product, I have millions of followers, and you can just turn it on. Most of us, me included, you have to start from close to zero. Or if you have a handful of followers, maybe, you have 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 followers, you need to be able to convert those followers into whatever your new media product is. So in this case, podcasting, and it takes time. The Founder's Mind started in September 2017, and it wasn't until June 2018 that I released my first episode. And the steps in between, I've already talked about some. I came up with the name. I ran it through Namecheck. The digital naming gods were on my side that day. Got all of that. Created a landing page. And then I started inviting people to interview. And then I actually booked a bunch of interviews. And I realized I should probably buy a mic, because you need a microphone to interview people, or at least I thought you did. And it's not the mic that I have now. This is a very nice mic, and I'll talk about it in a couple minutes. It was like a $200 Yeti mic, which is like the number one mic for, I would say, consumer podcasters. So I bought the mic, I interviewed a bunch of people, and then I realized I had to edit all the episodes. And by this time, it's January, February of 2018. I'm sitting on 10 episodes, and I'm thinking to myself, this show is never going to become a real thing if I can't find someone or do the editing myself. And so I ended up finding an editor, because for every hour of audio I did, it was hours of editing, because it is not my skill. I just didn't have it, you know? And the show released in June 2018, and it took another year plus for me to be engaged in conversations about a sponsor. This all takes time. Building an audience takes time. Even building a storyline takes time. If I listen to my first 15 episodes in my interview style, I cringe thinking about just like my flow, how I would ask questions compared to the way I ask questions now. And I just think it's important to really think about this. Think about the long haul. Think about sort of what are some of your long-term visions around creating a podcast, and know that it'll take time. For me, the goal has always been use my podcast as an excuse to meet interesting people that I may not otherwise come in contact with. And it has done that in spades. Some people's goals are monetization. Some people's goals are converting to clients. I'm not opposed to any of that. But it wasn't the driving focus of the show. And so, again, getting the results that you want can take time, but also being clear on the results that you're trying to generate. It also, I think in this piece, there was a question that was submitted during registration, sort of how do you start a show and how do you keep up the cadence, or how do you keep up the momentum? And I think in that realm, okay, people are writing notes. Okay. In that realm, that's a hard thing to be conscious of. And I'll share my story. When I first launched the show, June 2018, my goal was to release weekly episodes until I got to 52. I was like, I'm going to do weekly episodes until I get to 52 episodes. It is going to be baller. I cannot wait. And I hit the ground running. I did weekly episodes until late December 2018. And then my wife gave birth to my first child, and my entire calendar was knocked sideways. And like in a good way, in a beautiful way, but I realized that it was unrealistic in the context of my life at that time. And so for a lot of 2019, the show didn't flounder, but it was very sporadic. I released a couple episodes in the beginning of 2019. I released a burst of episodes in end of July, August, and September of 2019, all with the attempt of like, I'm going to get back to my weekly episode release schedule. And in September 2019, I had a conversation with myself that I have with my clients, which was, what rules am I following for no reason? And I realized that I was trying to release weekly episodes because that's what the podcast world said I should do. Or I realized that I was trying to release very regular content because the podcast world says if you want to build an audience, if you want to become an influencer, you need to be consistent in that realm. And there's truth to that. But I remembered that the reason why I started my show was to meet really interesting people and have interesting conversations. And that didn't require that I release weekly episodes. And so September 2019, I gave myself a break that I challenge clients to give themselves all the time. Sometimes we don't listen to ourselves. And in the same month, and this is not a joke, that was the same month that a CEO of a very well-funded company reached out to me on Twitter, and we started tweeting at each other. And then we got coffee, and it was all around this question of, what episode should I listen to of The Founder's Mind? And can you tell me more about your podcast? And it ended up leading to a sponsorship that kicked off this March of 2020. And this kind of goes back to the core of a lot of my belief structure, and it's the same with my podcast. When you create a piece of content, or when you create a piece of work, and it's responding to something sort of at a core level, you will get the best results. When you start doing things because you think that it's what you should be doing, or you're trying to respond to a trend, you might get some traction, but the sustainability may not be there. Or you may not end up with the true results that you're looking for. And I share that because I do have a sponsor. And when people ask me how I got my sponsor, it's not quite a formulaic route. It's not like I have 50,000 downloads, not even close, by the way, per episode. Uh, and then you can monetize it that way. I was staying true to my audience and to my story and to the people that I interviewed, and it resonated with a startup and a company in my market, and it kicked off a conversation. So I just share that as a side. So I'm back to now I'm doing every other week. So 2 episodes a month starting in March. And that's going to go through August, which is the deal with my sponsor. And we're going to assess where things are from there. But for me, it's feeding the show and it's feeding my ability to meet people and talk to people. So really honing into why the show. I didn't even put sponsor as a milestone because it wasn't something that I started the show for. I started the show to talk to people, like I said. So some milestones that have been really interesting. I've talked to New York Times bestsellers. My favorite business author, hands down, is Daniel Pink. He's written a bunch of New York Times bestsellers. He lives in the DC area. He went to Northwestern. I went to 5 schools. One of them was Northwestern. But every time I saw him at an event, I would mention that. And he ended up asking him to be on the show, and he ended up coming on the show. And when I started my show originally, I said, what if Daniel Pink was one of my first 100 guests? That would be really cool. That would be like the goal for the show. And he was guest number 14. And then I realized that I may have set the bar a little too low, or I may have kind of restrained myself in my thinking. But I think, again, what are the goals and what are you trying to accomplish? And being vigilant with yourself about that. So if I look at why I started my podcast, I can tell you that I have accomplished the goals and I'm continuing to accomplish the goals. If I were to tell you that my podcast gets on average 200 downloads per episode, which is almost the exact median of the entire podcast industry, people may not believe the types of guests that I've gotten on the show. And I'm very candid about my numbers because the podcasting world is pretty gray in analytics and in coverage. And so there's this sense that, and I mentioned this in the beginning around the myths, that you need to have a huge audience, or that you need to have certain level of influence. But if you focus on the brand, the content, why you're doing a podcast, you will find people that will say yes to you. I mean, I've talked to people that have raised $40 million in funding and are growing a business globally. You know, Daniel Pink also has a top TED Talk. I even had someone reach out to me before I had released an episode just based around the brand that I had created. And I had done no marketing. It was the weirdest thing. But I think when you focus on sort of those core elements of why you're doing something and what motivates you and what's exciting for you, you will start to see reaction, response. One of the things that I do with my show is when I'm sourcing guests, I do look for guests who are very generous on their social media. So not just they have a big audience, but like when they are on a podcast or when someone writes an article about them, they share that to their audience. Because they're like, Daniel Pink doesn't share every time he's on a podcast with his 500,000 followers, because he would be sharing every day only about interviews he does, right? Which it's great to have him on the show, but you have someone like, and I know some people in this group will know, like Mandela Dixon, she's very generous. Ruben Harris, he's very generous. And these are people with 50,000, 60,000 followers, which is, again, far beyond my audience size. And so that's also a milestone, is finding people that are excited to be on the show and then also very generous with their audience. That can help with exposure, notoriety, relevance, and in depending on what your goals are, it can help with cachet. So for me, one of my big goals has been, I want to be someone who's supporting women entrepreneurs, people of color who are entrepreneurs, people in the LGBTQI community who are entrepreneurs. And so my guests I strategically have picked a lot of guests that are in that space. And it's made it easier for me to enter into conversations because I'm learning, but also I can show, like, I've had conversations with people that are trailblazing in certain industries and are challenging certain norms. So back to goals and sort of why you do a show. For me, that's been another big milestone, even though it's not listed here. And speaking engagements have led to clients. So if you're a host, if you're a storyteller, if you're talking about a certain you know, section of the world or a certain bucket of content, it becomes something that you can point to. And it's kind of funny because it's self-published and it's not regulated and there's literally no barrier to entry. But if you are really consequent about how you portray your message and that it really is something that resonates with who you are in your work, you can point to it and people will take note. And so just something to consider and something that served me very well. I can point to this and say, yeah, I've released 51 episodes in conversations with founders and New York Times bestsellers. And it becomes, even by association, that I have some of this information or I have some of this perspective. In solo shows, by the way, same thing. If you're not doing an interview-based show, mine are interview-based because I love to talk to people and I'm a bit of an extrovert. And I don't think that people want to listen to me all the time. Occasionally on a workshop, maybe. But individual interview also, if you're just, not interview, if you're just doing like a narrative, there's the same opportunity. And then the side effect is every interview I've done, I run through a transcription service and it becomes written content. If you do a narrative and it's not interview based, you can run it through a transcription service and you get written content, whether you want to write articles, blog posts, social media posts, if you want to write a book. I've done 52 interviews. That's almost 52 hours of audio. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of words that are sort of out there for me to work with. Depending on your work style and your workflow, that can be a really good way to jumpstart other content creation. And one of the questions that came up in the registration was like, why should I start a podcast and why? And I think in one realm, no, not everyone needs a podcast. But in another perspective, if you're trying to create content and you haven't found a rhythm or flow, it might even just be a good way for you to generate some of that content and get into a movement. Whether you get hundreds and thousands of downloads or literally no downloads or 10, you can still work it. And if you have clients or customers, it's a piece of content that you can send to your clients and customers. Even if they're the only listeners, they see that you're thinking about things and talking about things. And most people, by the way, last time I checked in 2018, I think 17% of Americans listen to podcasts. It's a really small number when you think about the amount of people that watch TV or the amount of people that are on social. So majority of people, and if you're listening to this and you're one of those people, not trying to take advantage of you, majority of people don't understand how easy it actually is to set up a podcast. So it's still impressive if you have a podcast. Like, oh, like this is seems like it's well put together, and like they're really onto something here. For people in the podcast space, we know, and you will know, and you may already know, you can kind of kick one up pretty quickly. And I'll talk about that in a second. So tips, I think this is super important. I think this is, when people talk about like what equipment, what services, all sorts of things to use, a quiet room is better than a good mic, like a really quiet space. Great sound is better than a good editor. So that goes back to quiet room. Great content trumps nice equipment every day of the week. Good stories is greater than notable guests. And I think that's a really hard one for people to grapple with because you want to get that exposure. But when people ask me what's the best thing I've heard on my show, I always tell them about Katie McCabe, who's a solopreneur photographer in New York. And she shared that when she would make decisions around her business because she felt like she had to, she would always make a mistake. And when she made decisions that followed her gut and her heart, she always made the right decision. And like that for me is the most impactful thing I've heard with 52 guests and with some of the most like honestly influential people in certain industries. So I really think if you focus in on the story and you focus in on whatever content you're trying to explore, it'll trump a notable guest. You may get notable guests, which is amazing, but it's not the driver. What you care about is greater than what you think people will listen to. And this is true in so many areas of life and work. But when we start to do things because we think it's what people will respond to, is never going to pan out the way we want. And I always look at Twitter this way. Every now and then I'll be like, oh, I got this great thing. I'm going to tweet it. And like nothing happens. And I don't have them. I have like 800 followers. I don't have that many followers. And like randomly I'll tweet something that I'm not even, I'm like, I don't know, just put it out there. And like it gets a bunch of likes or retweets or like people comment on it. It gets a bunch of traction. Or I think my most trafficked tweet was I shared a link in response to someone else's tweet. And then all of a sudden, all sorts of people were like liking and retweeting that. And it was just me responding to something. So really just focusing on sort of your core, what are the things that you're trying to do in the show, in the conversation, in the content, you'll get the best results. Even if, and I'm not going to jump all the way back, but even if it takes time, right? And I think that's really the big thing. There are a lot of analogies, but Warren Buffett, the champion of compound interest, it's a series of small things over time that make a big impact. And I've seen that with the show, including getting to a sponsor. And I got the sponsor because I was really sticking to my content and really sticking to why I started the show, because in every other metric, I shouldn't have a sponsor, because I can't say I have 7,000 downloads per episode, so that's worth $30 per thousand, and so it becomes a different conversation. Resources. So these are a couple. I started the podcast website on Squarespace. I still use Squarespace. I used to use Squarespace has an RSS feature. So when you upload a piece of audio, you can actually use that to subscribe to push to like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all that. So I started on Squarespace. People in the podcast world will say, not the best idea, but it's totally functional. And if you already have a Squarespace site and you don't want to rethink everything, it's a great starting place. I started with a Yeti mic. It's $200. A good microphone, even if it's like $100 to $200, will make a huge difference in the way that your audio sounds. And if you edit it yourself, you will have to do way less work. And if you give it to an editor who, even with all of their magic tricks, could make certain sounds go away, it'll make it way easier for them to work with the audio. Since I got a sponsor, I've been upgraded to the mic I'm using now. It is much more expensive, and I have two of them, which is, I'm very grateful, eternally grateful to my sponsor, who I feel like I should mention, Upside Business Travel. They have done a lot for the show and in keeping it going. This mic is $500. When I listened back to the audio for the first time, it like crushed my soul, the difference in sound. It sounded a lot better. So if you have the money and you want to buy, an incredible mic, the Shure SM7B is an incredible one. And if you look at this, I'm just going to leave it up here for a second. If you take a look at this, when you're on Instagram or when you're watching on YouTube now and you see people interviewing, they probably have this mic. I mean, like Alexis Ohanian, Serena Williams' husband, all the audio that you see him doing, he's on this mic with his guests and stuff like that. Hosting, and I want to talk about a couple things with hosting. When you talk about what is it going to take to start a show, or what do I need to start a show, the simple, most basic, absolute easiest thing to do, and I didn't do this myself because they weren't around when I started, is Anchor.fm. So if you download Anchor.fm, you can literally start an RSS feed, which is an important component of a podcast. That's how it gets syndicated and pushed to other channels like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. But you can literally download the app on your phone. You can create your name. You can start recording on it. You can have people call in, so you could do interviews, through Anchor.fm, or they might have to download the app. But it is super straightforward. Will your audio be the best? Maybe not. But again, stories and content trump audio quality. If you're going to go a little beyond that, I used to use Transistor FM. It was very functional. Most of these, by the way, like Squarespace, Transistor, Simplecast, all this stuff, most of these are about 15 to 20 bucks a month each. But you don't need a website for your podcast. You could just use a hosting platform. Now I'm using Simplecast. I think it's $20 a month. Simplecast is where you would upload the audio, where you put in the cover art, where you put in the show notes, where you put in all the details. And then using a platform like Simplecast, you can literally, they walk you through pushing it to Apple, pushing it to Spotify, pushing it to YouTube. They have all these, they talk you through all the integrations. So if you want to do like lowest sort of like maintenance of a show, you can do a hosting platform and just push it. And then if you have your own audience, you can either create social channels like I described with the Founder's Mind, or if you have your own audience, you can just create the show and then share with your email list or your audience or anything like that. And this kind of leads me to the second show that Brooke mentioned. During this unbelievable journey that we're all on with called socially distanced and social distancing and coronavirus, this is just such an unbelievable time. I'm a hyper extrovert. Like, I need to connect with people, or I think the blood starts draining from my face. And one of the things that I decided to do was, I said, you know what, I'll just start another podcast. I'll just interview people that are socially distancing. I'll start with my friends and I'll just go for it. And I did something really, really aggressive, which was just start it, created a logo on Canva, started a new RSS feed in Simplecast, recorded a trailer and just added it to Simplecast and then submitted it to Apple Podcasts. This took like 30 minutes, like Canva logo, Simplecast account, and just like plugging things in and recording. I did like a one take on the intro. And I then I did 15 interviews in 3 weeks. I did 5 interviews a week for 3 weeks. And I just, no edits. I called it a no frills podcast. I just said, this is socially distanced, welcome to the show. This is the guest. And then we talked. And then at the end I said, thank you for listening to the show. And I had one sign off line and then I would end it. And then I just cut the front and end and I just uploaded it. And it was so easy. And so I think in one realm, we think about, what are all the things I have to do? What are all the steps? Is it perfect? Is it not perfect? But it can also be very, very easy, and it can be very fluid. And I think if we give ourselves the space to be imperfect and to experiment and to explore and to put something out there and get feedback from the world, I think it can be a very generative experience. So socially distance it met its need. And so it's on pause because I am focusing on the Founder's Mind. But I also helped my dad start a podcast that we've been talking about for a long time. So part of my socially distanced experience is I'm actually at my parents' house since the March 16th for a lot of reasons. They have a yard. I don't. They're more adults and I have a child. But we actually started another show, Papa's Library, which is him narrating children's stories that he comes up with. And because he can't see his grandkids the way he used to on my brother's side, we share those stories. The purpose is to share those stories with his grandkids, but we've also shared it with friends and family, and their kids have been able to listen to it. And so I think it's really around this sort of, why are you starting a show? What's energizing you about it? And it can be a sponsored big production with editors and producers and things like that, all the way down to, I'm just going to throw something up there, share it with clients, share it with friends, see what I get, to, I'm just going to stick with this until I'm not interested anymore and see what happens. And it takes time. It really does. Does this go until 45?
Yes. Yeah. We have scheduled.
Okay. I can talk forever because I'm an extrovert like that. But I think the next slide, unless I'm totally wrong, is a bunch of questions that were already asked. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I've answered them or not.
Yeah. Well, if anybody wants to jump into the chat and, have a question, feel free. That would be awesome. Because then I have a question. I don't want to take But you mentioned, and thank you so much. It's all really helpful. I think big takeaways I got were like, kind of just go for it. And I feel that analyzation by paralyzation, wanting everything to be perfect and putting yourself out there is kind of nerve wracking as well.
For sure.
So huge takeaway. Thank you. And then my question is, you mentioned your first 15 episodes were a little cringeworthy with your interview questions. So I would love tips on that. Like any interview tips, like how to ask good questions. Do you prepare before? Do you kind of go with the flow? Like just anything in that area would be awesome.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'll tell you the reason why the first 15 interviews were super awkward listening back is because they were super awkward while I was interviewing people, because I basically created these, like, I created like 5 to 10 questions, and I put pressure on myself saying, I need to ask the same 5 to 10 questions to every guest so that I can create these streams of like, this is what this guest said. This is what this guest said. Which is a style, by the way, and it might totally work for some people. Like if you're more anthropological or research based, that might be a really, really good style for you, because you want to get a consistent, 100 people answered this question this way. But this goes back to sort of what's my style and what resonates. I am a very go with the flow person. And so I shifted to 3 questions, and I would start with a question, which was really easy. Like I'd say, I could go over your bio, but why would I do that when we could hear it from you? Could you, I would love to hear a little bit about you and like what you're doing. And then when someone launches into that, sometimes it's a minute, sometimes it's like 4 minutes, they're talking about themselves. I get a ton of information about what I can ask next. Oh, you told me you did this, or you were in Chicago at this time, or, you had this opportunity, or, you mentioned this about writing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And for me, it's always sort of, I have 2 goals with interviews. One is, if you know your guest and you've seen the other things that they've talked about, I love to hear from guests. I'm trying to find out, like, tell me something that you don't usually talk about on your circuit. So Daniel Pink's a great example. That dude was on like a billion podcast interviews when I interviewed him, because he was releasing When. And in the conversation, and this is not a joke. It's not a joke. I learned that Daniel Pink married someone who is from New Mexico. I also married someone who's from New Mexico. And so we go on this just dovetail on like green or red chili, and we're talking about other things. But that's what's really interesting, because it's different, and it gets his brain into a different place, and you can learn something new about someone. So I would say that's when I started structuring the interviews around my comfort level and what my style was, I immediately started clicking more. And I am not a big preparer.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. I think I've done the same. Like we had somebody coming and talking, Jonathan, on guesting on podcasts, and I was like, That makes me nervous to prepare, so I kind of just wing it. And anyway, but so I can relate. Yeah. So we have some questions in the chat. Darren asked, what's the one thing to do tomorrow to get the ball rolling on a new podcast? The most impactful thing we can all do.
That's a great question. I mean, it depends on where everyone is in what stage of thinking about a podcast. So if you have a name and you have the domain and social handles, if that's your route, like if you want to create a bunch of channels around the show, the next thing is creating that landing page or inviting people to be on the show. See what kind of response you get. If you don't have a name or any of that, think about it. What's the content of your show? What do you want it to be about? And don't beat yourself up about a perfect name. It will evolve, and you will lean into the show will evolve around the name. If you don't want to spend money on equipment or anything, Anchor.fm is probably your best shot. Download the app, and it will walk you through setting up a podcast, and you can start creating content. Yeah. And then thinking about having a trailer is, will about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes will give people a little sample, and will give people to look at as you're if you're doing an interview-based show, give people something to listen to or look at as you're looking for guests.
Awesome. Okay, another question from Katrine. Editing. If you don't have an editor, what tool and how much editing?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And I wish my editor was on here to speak fully on this because he can give you the real talk.
Mhm.
But I can tell you a couple of things. One, the amount that's had to be edited on my show has decreased over the, let's say, like every 10 episodes. The way I interview and the organization and cleanliness of the interview has reduced the editing burden on my editor. And so it depends on your show. If it's a narrative and you're like, here's a piece of research, here's an interview I did with someone, and here is my perspective, and you have like 3 segments, you probably have to do more editing. If it's an interview and the interview is pretty straightforward, um, which a lot of them are these days, if I'm being honest, I think people are getting better at telling their story. You might not have to edit it a lot. I think a big piece with editing is um, if the content is good, if the story is good, if you're doing something that you really are excited about, you will be telling good stories. I promise you. The audio quality can be okay. It doesn't have to be amazing. Okay, the audio quality will distract listeners to the extent that they want to be distracted. Right? If you have like a show that you're like, I don't really know why I'm doing this. I'm just going to do this thing, and there's not a full direction, or like it's different every episode, and the audio is also bad. People will get distracted, and then they'll remember that maybe there's not a direction here. So you may not have to edit that much. Just don't have like barking dogs, or like sirens going through your show. There's like NPR, and then like the Joe Rogans and Tim Ferrisses of the world, who can pay for all the equipment that they want, but they're not radio professionals. And then there's, I would say, like almost the majority of other decent shows who are like me, recording on a nice mic in a quiet enough place. And then there's like another group who just don't care about the sound at all. So if you can get a quiet room and you've got an interesting story, you may not have to edit that much at all. I pay my editor $150 an episode, just as a watermark for everyone. Some people pay a lot more. I had someone ask me how much my production team costs, and I said, understand that I have a sponsor, and they are paying for them, and they're pretty expensive. And he was looking for like guidance on a lower number, and I was like, I don't know. This is what it was like. It's hundreds of dollars an episode for some companies, but if you use Upwork or Fiverr, you'll find someone who will edit your show for you at a reasonable rate, guaranteed. And to contract someone for like 2 or 3 episodes and see what it feels like, see how it sounds, and see how it works. And if it's good, you can keep working with them.
Awesome. So a couple more questions came in, but we're hitting time, so let me know when, but we have
I
two
have
more.
time. I have time if other people have time. I'm just putting it out there.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So the next one kind of leans on what you just said. So it's about, do you have a recommendation that wouldn't sound demanding for guests in their mic, kind of their sound and their quality of audio, and how you go about that?
That is a very good question. If it's someone who is on the interview circuit, they may already have a good setup. So if you're doing interviews, which is really helpful. If it's not, you might think about creating like and I don't have this, I haven't done this. So this is a good idea that I just haven't executed on, but like a 1-pager on like recording best practices. Like put in headphones because they might actually be better audio than your computer mic, or that, like the mic on your AirPods might not pick up as much noise as a computer mic. If you have a nice mic, plug it in. Um, I think you can give like 3 levels of recommendation. If you got a nice mic, use it. If you don't, use headphones. If you don't worry. Really. I mean, like my episode 3 from season 2, which is one with my sponsor, I interviewed the sponsor of my show, the CEO of the sponsor of my show, and he was just recording on his laptop. I had my mic, which is the consistent, right? Like my sound is my sound, but guests are going to call in. I mean, it's like when you watch if you watch the news, which I have tried not to do recently, but if you watch the news, you got people calling in on cell phones. I mean, always for eternity. They call in. Sometimes they have a professional equipment. Sometimes they don't. Yeah. I maybe have them record on their phone. I actually do that. I'll say, can you open up voice memos? Some people navigate that no problem. Some people don't, and that's fine. Recording on their phone is a really good idea. There are other platforms that I don't use, like Zencaster or Squadcast, which also cost like $30 to $40 a month, which have some recording tools. With Zoom, you can set up your Zoom settings in audio to record 2 separate audio tracks. So 1 audio per listener or per speaker, excuse me. That's a really good thing to do. If you have an editor, they will love you. If you're editing it, you will love yourself. Literally on an old episode, my editor was like, "Did you burp when that person was talking?" And I was like, "Oh shit." And because there wasn't 2 tracks, it was just right. I was trying to be subtle, but it was there. And so 2 audio tracks do it.
That's an awesome story. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that with us. Great. And then, so from Jess is talking about promoting them. I think that was one of the ones that came in earlier too. When is a good time to start heavily promoting? And is it better to do a few episodes? I know you mentioned a trailer, like, do you have to do an episode for that? So as far as like when that comes in to start kind of pushing it to Twitter or anything like that. Yeah.
I think if I were to do this again, I would get at least a month's worth of content lined up. And I would have my trailer lined up. I would have my episodes like recorded and edited and ready. And I would maybe even just like, if you're doing social channels, like if you have social channels, or maybe you don't have social channels yet and you're just using your own personal channels, I would start talking about the show and getting people like know that it's coming. Then I would release the trailer. Then I would get aggressive, pushing people to get to them to subscribe and listen to the trailer. And in that cadence, be like, episodes coming next week. And then you start releasing and promoting. There's a lot of content out there about the algorithm. So if your goal is to grow a show and grow an audience, there's a lot of good information about the algorithms that are out there. But I would definitely get a pipeline of stuff, pre-write some things, just so that I'm assuming no one is quitting their job and becoming a full-time podcaster. So like knowing that like we all have so many priorities, that if you can prepare yourself a little bit and be a little bit, sort of ahead of schedule, that's like totally the doctor saying don't smoke cigarettes and smoking cigarettes. I'm not like that. But if I was a person that was like that, I would highly recommend it.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think we can probably wrap it up after
Sure.
the little over, but honestly, thank you so much. This is really helpful. I know Darren and I have like mentioned so many times, like, we should start a podcast, and run into all the issues you said, like probably thinking too much about it and just not knowing what's ahead of us. But this is just incredibly helpful.
I mean, if that's Darren's iPhone, if he's on there, I'll text him after this too. Just start it.
Just do it every day.
I mean, I don't know if a company's ever used the term "just do it," but it's a good idea.
Yeah, we should start it. We should start saying it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Be sure to look me up. Hit me up. If people have questions that I didn't answer, email me. Find me on LinkedIn. Find me anywhere. I will respond. I'm happy to answer other questions. I'm happy to give you as many resources as I've had. Point you in whatever direction. But don't feel like this is the end of a conversation. If you want to continue it, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll, if you sign up on the Eventbrite, we'll send a follow-up email with a bunch of links and stuff for Adam. And if you're in the Work From community, the Slack community, we'll post a bunch of stuff in there. And if you're not in the Slack community, you should definitely join us. workfrom.co/premium. And that's it. Thank you so much, Adam. And everybody else, I hope you have a really great day.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening and for asking questions.
Okay, bye.